The moon was high over the riverside town of Omehia when the first scream tore through the silence. It was not a small cry, but a jagged sound of pure terror. The neighbors, still dressed in their night wrappers, rushed out of their beautiful homes to stand before the tallest mansion on the street. Inside, the lights flickered like dying stars. Sophia, the woman everyone admired, was wailing behind the reinforced glass windows. Her voice was thin, desperate, and sharp enough to cut the heavy night air. "Help me! Please, don't let him do it!" she cried. The crowd whispered, their hearts racing as they stared at the closed mahogany doors. Then the house went deathly quiet. The massive front door swung open slowly, and Darren stepped out into the porch light. He looked perfect, as he always did, wearing a silk dressing gown that cost more than most people earned in a year. His face held a look of deep, patient sadness. He looked at the gathered neighbors and sighed, shaking his head. "I am so sorry to wake you all," he said, his voice smooth like expensive honey. "My dear Sophia is not well. The doctors say her mind is playing tricks on her again." The neighbors nodded in sympathy, their suspicion melting away. But inside the house, Sophia's muffled voice came from the shadows. "Don't let him lock me in there!" To understand the scream, we must go back to the day Sophia first arrived. Omehia was a town where wealth flowed as fast as the river, and Darren was the king of the street. When he brought Sophia home as his bride, the whole town stood still. She was breathtaking, with a smile that could light up the darkest room. Darren showered her with gold jewelry, designer handbags, and a car that shimmered like a pearl. As they walked hand in hand to church, the women whispered behind their fans. "She is the luckiest woman alive," they said with heavy envy. Sophia smiled back at them, but if you looked closely, her eyes were searching for something. Their mansion was a masterpiece of modern architecture, standing at the very edge of the town where the land met the water. It was beautiful, but the air around it always felt a few degrees colder than the rest of the street. On the day they moved in, a woman with skin like wrinkled leather approached Sophia. She was the oldest resident of Omehia, and people said she could see things hidden in the wind. She leaned in close, the smell of ancient herbs following her. "Listen to me, daughter," the old woman whispered, her eyes milky and wise. "This land has a long memory. It does not give for free." Sophia shivered. That night, as the river lapped against the stone walls of the garden, Sophia lay awake. Darren was breathing deeply beside her, looking like a peaceful prince. The house was silent, but then a sound rose from the earth itself. It was a low, rhythmic thrumming that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. She sat up, her heart hammering against her ribs. Then she heard it, a faint, liquid whisper that seemed to slide through the air conditioning vents. It spoke her name, Sophia. It didn't sound like a human voice. It sounded like the rushing of water against the shore. She pulled the silk covers to her chin, her eyes wide in the dark. As Sophia explored her new palace, she found a door at the very back of the long marble hallway. It was different from the others, made of dark, heavy wood and reinforced with iron bolts. There was no handle, only a single strange keyhole. When she asked Darren about it during breakfast, his charming smile didn't reach his eyes. The room went silent, the only sound being the clink of his silver spoon against the porcelain. "That is my private study, Sophia. A wife does not need to know everything her husband does to provide for her. Never ask me about that room again." Despite his warning, the door haunted Sophia's thoughts. One afternoon, while Darren was at his office, she stood before the dark wood. She leaned her ear against the grain, holding her breath. At first, there was nothing. Then a soft scratching sound started, like nails on stone. Then came the whisper, muffled and weak. "Help me, please. It's so cold." Sophia froze, her blood turning to ice. The voice sounded like a human, but as she listened, it shifted. It became a chorus of many voices, overlapping and desperate. "Let us out," they moaned. Sophia backed away, her hands trembling, nearly tripping over a decorative vase. The house felt like it was breathing. The next morning, Darren was the perfect husband again. He brought Sophia a breakfast of exotic fruits and pastries, kissing her forehead with redirected tenderness. In the afternoon, they hosted a small garden party. Darren laughed with the men about business and real estate, while the neighbors watched them with longing. "Look at how he cares for her," one woman said to her husband. "Why can't you be like Darren?" Sophia tried to speak, tried to hint at the coldness in the hallway, but the neighbors just laughed. "You are just bored in that big house," they told her. Sophia realized then that the truth had no home in Omehia. As the days passed, the street began to turn its back on Sophia. Darren had carefully planted seeds of doubt among the neighbors. He told them he was worried about her fantasies and her unstable moods. When Sophia walked to the local market, the traders whispered as she passed. "She complains while eating from a golden plate," a fabric seller hissed. "She is ungrateful and strange. Perhaps she is even cursed." Sophia felt the weight of their judgment like a physical burden. She stayed inside more, watching the river from her window. She felt completely alone, trapped in a beautiful cage, while the world outside cheered for her captor. That night, Sophia fell into a deep, feverish sleep. She dreamed the river behind the house turned into thick, black oil. It rose up, flooding the garden and seeping under the doors. Figures began to emerge from the dark water, their bodies thin and trailing river weeds. They reached out to her with translucent hands, their eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. One figure stepped closer than the rest, wearing a tattered wedding dress that looked familiar. When the figure lifted its head, Sophia gasped in horror. The face beneath the veil was her own, but it was pale, lifeless, and weathered by the current. She woke up screaming, her nightgown soaked with sweat. Driven by a desperate need for answers, Sophia sought out the old woman again. She found her sitting by the riverbank, tossing dried petals into the water. "You saw the faces, didn't you?" the old woman asked without turning around. She told Sophia a legend that the town had tried to forget. Many years ago, a man made a pact with a jealous river spirit. The spirit would grant him endless wealth and power, but in exchange it demanded the souls of those he claimed to love most. "Your husband did not build his empire with hard work, child. He built it with the breath of others," the woman said, her voice trembling. Sophia returned home with a heart full of fire and fear. She waited until Darren was in the shower, then she crept toward the forbidden door. She pushed against it with all her strength, but it felt like pushing against a mountain. She touched the wood and a sudden searing heat flashed through her palm. She pulled back, seeing a red burn mark on her skin. From behind the door, a new whisper emerged, louder than before. It was not a plea this time, but a warning. "He is coming," the voices hissed in unison. "The time of the moon is near. He will come for the final piece of the debt." Sophia knew she had to find the key. She began to watch Darren's every move, hiding in the shadows of the gallery. She noticed that every evening before bed, Darren would stand before a small carved obsidian statue in his dressing room. It was a figure of a creature that was half man and half fish. One night he saw him twist the head of the statue and reach inside. Her breath hitched as she saw the glint of silver. It was a long, ancient-looking key with a handle shaped like a weeping eye. He tucked it back inside and smiled a dark, satisfied smile. Sophia finally knew where the secret lived. The opportunity came on the night Darren had to attend a late-night board meeting. As soon as his car cleared the gates, Sophia ran to the dressing room. Her hands shook as she twisted the obsidian head. The key was there, cold and heavy in her palm. She sprinted to the back hallway, the silence of the house pressing against her ears. She reached the door and slid the key into the eye-shaped hole. It turned with a sound like grinding teeth. The iron bolts slid back on their own, and the heavy door creaked open. A
A smell of stagnant water and ancient dampness spilled out into the air. The walls were covered in strange glowing markings that pulsed like a heartbeat. As her eyes adjusted, she saw them, shadowy figures huddled in the corners. They were not solid, but like smoke caught in a breeze. They drifted towards her, their voices 1,000 rustling leaves. "We were like you," the shadows whispered, their eyes glowing with a faint blue light. Wives who believed in the dream, promises of love turned into sacrifices for gold. One reached out, and its cold hand grabbed her ankle. "You are the last," the shadows moaned, their eyes glowing with a faint blue light. "He needs one more to seal the gates of wealth forever. You are the final payment." Sophia tried to pull away, but the water around her feet began to swirl like a whirlpool. She realized
The room wasn't just a room. It was a bridge to the deep, hungry places of the river. The markings on the walls began to glow brighter, reflecting the terror in her soul. She saw the names of women carved into the stone, and the last space was empty, waiting for her. She had seen the truth, and the truth was a grave. A sudden light blinded her as the door was kicked open. Darren stood there, but the charming man was gone. His eyes were wide and filled with a terrifying, shimmering light. He didn't look angry, he looked hungry. "You shouldn't have opened it, Sophia," he said, his voice echoing with a strange, double tone. He stepped into the water and it did not splash. It moved away from him in respect. "Everything you see, the gold, the cars, the envy of the street, I paid for it with the lives of those before you. And now the river is calling for the final debt. You will pay too." Darren explained the ritual with a calm that was more frightening than a scream. The river spirit was ancient and greedy. It had given him the power to dominate the town, but it required a sequence of sacrifices to keep the fountain of wealth flowing. Sophia was the final piece of the puzzle. The great celebration for their anniversary, scheduled for the following night, was actually the setting for her disappearance. "The neighbors will think you finally lost your mind and ran away," Darren whispered, stepping closer. "And I will be the grieving widower that everyone pities and admires." He lunged, catching her arm with a grip like iron. Sophia didn't fight him with strength. She went limp, letting him believe she was broken by the terror. He locked her in their bedroom, thinking her spirit was crushed. But as soon as he left, Sophia began to think. She remembered the old woman's words, "Truth must be seen, not spoken." She realized that if she just told the neighbors, they would call her crazy. She needed them to witness the darkness themselves. She spent the night pretending to weep, but her mind was working fast. She found a small hidden camera Darren used for security and began to rewire the house's integrated media system. The next morning, Sophia acted like a perfect, obedient doll. She wore the heavy gold dress Darren chose for her and allowed the stylists to paint her face. Darren watched her closely, but he saw only a woman who had accepted her fate. "That's my girl," he said, touching her cheek. "Tonight we make history." The mansion was transformed into a paradise of flowers and lights. The finest chefs prepared a feast, and the most powerful people in Omehia arrived in their best attires. The air was filled with music and the sound of people talking about how blessed the couple was. The celebration reached its peak as the moon rose over the river. Darren took the microphone, standing on a podium in the center of the garden. "Tonight, I want to show you the heart of our home, a tradition of love." He began to lead Sophia toward the house, gesturing for the curious guests to follow. This was part of the ritual, to have a crowd of witnesses whose envy would fuel the spirit's transition. Sophia walked beside him, her heart thumping, but her hand was steady. She slipped a remote control out of her sleeve, her thumb resting on the button. Inside the house, they reached the hallway. The crowd stood behind them, peering into the luxury of the mansion. Darren reached for the forbidden door, ready to pull Sophia inside, while the spirit blinded the witnesses with a flash of light. But Sophia stopped. She turned to the neighbors, her voice loud and clear, cutting through the music. "You all envied my life. You called me ungrateful. Now come and see the price of your envy." She pressed the remote. Every screen in the mansion and the garden suddenly flickered to life, showing the horrifying images she had recorded earlier. Before Darren could react, Sophia threw open the door. The spirit, sensing the presence of so many unbelieving souls, lost its grip on the illusion. The room erupted. Black water gushed out into the hallway, carrying the smell of the deep. The shadowy figures of the lost wives became visible to everyone. The crowd recoiled in absolute horror as the glowing markings on the walls began to scream. The neighbors saw the faces of women who had disappeared years ago, their hands reaching out from the darkness. The perfect house was revealed to be a slaughterhouse of souls. The street was finally silenced by the truth. The river spirit rose from the floor, a towering mass of black mist and scales. It was furious. The ritual required a willing or unsuspecting sacrifice, but Sophia's defiance and the crowd's witness had broken the contract. The spirit turned its glowing, lidless eyes on Darren. He had promised a soul, and the debt had to be paid. Darren screamed, his wealth and charm failing him in an instant. The shadowy hands of the wives he had betrayed reached out and grabbed his silk suit. "Sophia, help me," he begged, his voice cracking. Sophia stood perfectly still, watching as the power he loved dragged him into the dark water. The spirit pulled Darren into the room, and the heavy door slammed shut with a final, echoing thud. The lights in the house returned to normal, but the mansion felt empty and hollow. The neighbors stood in the hallway, frozen in shame and fear. They could no longer look Sophia in the eye. The envy was gone, replaced by the bitter taste of their own blindness. Sophia walked out of the house and down to the riverbank. The old woman's voice seemed to echo in the wind. Envy blinds the truth, but courage sets it free. Sophia walked away into the dawn, a finally free woman.